When a show becomes really popular immediately after releasing, especially if it's an indie project, it's usually only a good thing. Millions of people fall in love with the world and characters, like surely that's a good thing. What else are you making a show for? Sterilizing people? But naturally, there's going to be a lot of people who grow attached to many of the characters to the point where they develop their own headcanons. This can be as simple as a neat bit of fun for people in the fandom, but in cases where a show is slowly releasing episodes and giving more details about the characters, like with the Amazing Digital Circus, it's common for popular headcanons that have existed for months to conflict with the actual canon. And when the actual canon portrays a character much differently to the fanon interpretation that's existed for months, some people are not going to be happy. Honestly, it's hard not to be impressed with the insane success of the Amazing Digital Circus. Even if you try your hardest not to care about it, there's no denying that its popularity is truly something to behold. And that's just looking at it from the perspective of it being an indie series. The show has already ingrained itself into pop culture in some insane ways, like these bootleg stage productions that give me nightmares. But the immense success of the series has been both a blessing and a curse. A blessing, for obvious reasons. I mean, come on, streaming is already destroying cable, Digital Circus is just whipping out the steel chair on a dead horse, but it's also a curse because, since this is an indie production, episodes take a very long time to finish and be released. All of the popularity you see for Digital Circus, that came from a single pilot, which by all means is impressive, but the 6-month gap between the pilot and episode 2 had naturally led to a ton of people writing their own fanfics and coming up with their own interpretations of the characters that are likely completely different from the actual canon of the show. And this alone isn't a problem until the people coming out with these headcanons are seriously put off by how different the show itself is, and act like the show itself is at fault for bad writing. And I saw a lot of this behavior over the last week from fans of the character Jax. Episode 2 really seems to have rubbed people the wrong way when it comes to Jax, as there's been a surprising amount of discussion about if his portrayal in the episode is in character or just poorly written, and we're going to talk about it. Now, to start this off, I just want to say that Jax is probably my favorite character next to Kinger. He's clearly written to be a complete and utter bastard, and his actions are meant to be comically cruel and unhinged. His complete sense of apathy towards everything that goes on in this world and the lengths he's willing to go to just to be entertained are darkly comical, and he's clearly not supposed to be likable in the traditional sense. I instead like him because he's such an irredeemable dick to the point that it's funny, and I think both the pilot and episode 2 do more than enough to show what kind of character he is. Of course, the show isn't finished yet, so there's no knowing if there's anything extra going on behind this unhinged brand of chaos, and it's sorta implied that something is going on with Jax, but for the time being we have a character who revels in chaos because he knows that there's no consequences for what happens in this digital dimension. Now, I know that this sort of character can be very hit or miss with people, and in fairness it's very easy to write a character like Jax completely wrong. The best example that comes to mind for me is Blue from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, who is pretty similar to Jax in a number of ways, but the big difference for me is that Blue is often the cause of conflicts in Foster's Home and generally has a far more obnoxious and mean-spirited attitude. While you're not supposed to like Blue, his attitude and antics are so obnoxious that his presence in an episode can get on a lot of people's nerves. Whereas Jax, while a complete douchebag, is just causing problems in a dimension where there aren't any real consequences for doing so, and also has a far more laid-back and apathetic approach to what he does that adds to the comedy. If Jax wasn't as laid back and seemed to care a great deal about making people miserable, I guarantee a lot less people would be fans of him. People are obviously allowed to not like Jax, but I think he's a perfectly fine, well-written, and entertaining character that could probably be tweaked to be slightly less cruel so he doesn't border on being completely intolerable to people. You can absolutely critique Jax. It's just that a lot of people's critiques aren't very good. In the second episode of Digital Circus, we get to see more of the characters in action as they participate in Kane's adventures. While the pilot did a good job at introducing everybody and their personalities, it was mostly centered on Pomni coming to grips with the new reality she's found herself in. Here though, everyone has a much more active role in a considerably more entertaining B-plot than the pilot had, and we get to see more of their dynamics between each other. However, things get a bit muddy for some people when taking Jax into consideration. In episode 2, Jax spends the whole episode intentionally trying to cause as much chaos as possible with very little regard for anyone's safety, and he does say and do some genuinely awful stuff. But this is where people think there's a problem, and there's a number of reasons why. A lot of people have tried arguing that Jax is incredibly out of character compared to how he was shown in the pilot, and that a lot of his antics in episode 2 are much crueler in comparison. Now, I definitely think that Jax's jackass levels, that's a neat bit of branding for you, are considerably higher in episode 2 compared to the pilot, and I think there's an argument to be made about him being a little overtuned. But out of character, I don't think so. Jax in the show's pilot was still capable of doing some pretty mean and unhinged stuff, from casually having everyone's room keys on standby, shoving Gangle and Kinger down a massive pit, kicking this sentient bowling pin, pushing Gangle out the way, generally just a lot of Gangle abuse honestly. Just because he's more of a chaotic mess in episode 2 doesn't mean that he's entirely out of character. He's just doing what he normally does but on a bigger scale, given it's a much bigger adventure than in the pilot, and a much more different scenario. I personally think he's a tiny bit overtuned for my tastes, but that's just my tastes. I think he's written perfectly here. We'll get into why people think this is out of character in a sec, but there's also another thing we gotta talk about. Some people began theorizing that the reason why Jax was much more of a twat in episode 2 than he was in the pilot was because Gooseworks intentionally went out of their way to rewrite them after fans grew attached to him. Some even went as far to say that this new version of Jax has basically no depth at all and is just a complete douche through and through. This was, of course, debunked immediately as Goose had finished the scripts for episodes 2, 3, and 4 before the pilot had even released, and even thinking about it logically, it's mostly just people coping and looking for someone to blame for a character not being how they expect it to be. I guarantee if Digital Circus began releasing episodes soon after the pilot premiered, there would be no issue here, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. In fact, anyone who's genuinely concerned about how Jax is being written or genuinely thinking that he's not going to have any sort of depth is jumping the gun far too early, because not only is this, again, I must stress this, only the second episode of the series, but it's already been confirmed by Goose before episode 2 release that we'll be learning more about Jax in a future episode and that he's a much more troubled character than he lets on. And episode 2 itself still manages to drop a couple of subtle hints that imply Jax is a much deeper character below the surface, and that this whole persona of his is just that, a persona. And to quickly go on a tangent, I'm so happy that it's been confirmed Digital Circus is mostly going to be a character-focused show instead of going all in on the lore and mysteries that are going to be giving film theory a steady supply of bread for the next 2 years or so, and it actually does make me pretty excited to see where they take Jax next when his episode finally arrives. I'm not expecting a typical sad backstory, I just really want to see how he's tackled given how insanely good this show seems to be at writing atmospheric and touching character moments, and I think people should reserve their judgment about Jax until the show is finished or until Jax gets the spotlight, even if you don't like him. It's hard for people to do that because of how big the gaps are between episodes, but at the end of the day, when this show is finished, we'll be able to watch it at a normal pace like every other TV show and can grow a greater sense of appreciation for how the character development is paced and implemented, instead of driving ourselves insane by conflating headcanons with the actual canon of the series. And that's the main problem here. Headcanons. It's the reason why people thought Jax was out of character, it's the reason why people accused Goose of rewriting him based on fan perception. It all comes down to the fact that for the past 6 months, half a year, fans of the series have only had a single pilot and a slew of fan material to satiate their hyperfixation over these characters. So much fan material, in fact, that it generally gets close to eclipsing the show in its entirety. Right, how do I start this? Headcanons are kind of fun, honestly. Though I'm not too involved in many fandoms these days, it was always fun coming up with my own headcanons for characters I really liked and sharing them with others. And from what I gathered, it was always in the name of fun, not something super serious or perfectly in line with what the characters would actually do. Some headcanons can come from places that aren't fully explored in the show. For example, my Steven Universe headcanon that I've had for years is that Peridot is autistic, because while it isn't outright stated, there are a lot of parallels, whether intentional or unintentional. Same thing for Marcy from Amphibia. I think headcanons at their best are completely harmless and fun interpretations that people can have about their favorite characters, though acknowledging that their interpretation is not what's actually reflected in the show itself. Headcanons at their worst, though, are when fan interpretations of characters become so popular that people become disillusioned with the actual canon and act as if it's the show's fault for this happening, which is what's clearly happened with Jax. That half-a-year gap between episodes led to a lot of fan interpretations of the character in fanfiction and fan comics, and a lot of them try to tell their own stories independent from the actual show given there was only one episode to work with at the time they were made. And Digital Circus has a massive fandom, so a lot of these kinds of fan projects got a lot of attention. Some of these projects are actually rather good and stand on their own compared to the show with their own merits. Some portrayed Jax as a sex offender, but considering all of this, it was no surprise that by the time episode 2 arrived, a lot of people had headcanon Jax as this super depressed character with a tortured past who developed this douchebag persona to keep himself sane, or something along those lines. Again, there's a lot of interpretations of Jax's character, and in all fairness, episode 2's trailer didn't really help this, since this shot made it look like Jax was having a sad moment all to himself, when in actuality he was just pissed he couldn't cause enough chaos that day. That definitely baited a lot of people into thinking Jax would be given more depth in this episode, which definitely contributed to people's disappointment and frustration. But putting that aside, this whole situation only proves that you should have the agency and self-awareness to not treat your own fanfictions and headcanons like they're fact, and not just an alternate part of the fiction you have created divorced from the show itself. I recognize that these fandom versions of Jax weren't just born from nothing. Statements from Gooseworks and hints in the show itself make it clear that Jax is a deeper character than what's currently being shown, and that this side of him is being built up to, instead of the show blowing its load and showing it off immediately. And people have taken that idea and have gone wild with it, and I do actually like a lot of what people have written about Jax, not that part, but it's just way too early to be calling any sort of shot on where the show is taking any of its characters yet. And it's certainly not okay to throw a tantrum because the show wasn't perfectly aligned with your fanfiction and is still taking the time to build up to the big and satisfying character moments. Bottom line is, episode 2 did not portray Jax any differently from how he was shown in episode 1. While his actions are a lot more severe, he is still the same character through and through, and this whole thing has been incredibly overblown. I mean no offense to any of the people that have already made threads and YouTube videos videos discussing how the public perception of Jax is completely flipped or going over their own grievances with him, but I think we all need to remember that this show is still relatively new and has barely gotten started yet. I know it's hard to forget that sometimes given its borderline transcendent popularity, but we just need to have a little more patience. Whatever Gooseworks has in store for Jax is sure to be interesting at the very least, and I think people will probably be satisfied. Of course, there's the possibility I'm wrong about all of this, but not to toot my own horn, I've had a pretty good track record of being right about this show so far. If you're still invested in your version of Jax, don't let me or anyone stop you from having fun with your writing. I'm legitimately impressed at the quality of a lot of the stuff I've seen in this fandom, and I'm sure if you put your mind to it, you can make something a lot of people will enjoy reading. But don't ever take it out on the show or its creator if things go down differently than you expected it to. Headcanons are not actual canon. I've seen a lot of fandoms go through this cycle of believing fan interpretations in the wake of content droughts for their favorite franchise, so let's not do that here, alright? Anyway, that's the end of the video. Play Yakuza or something.